In the world of Band of Brothers, few characters are as instantly recognizable or as thoroughly despised as Captain Herbert Sobel. From the opening scenes at Camp Tocoa, he is established as the primary antagonist of Easy Company's story. Portrayed as petty, vindictive, and relentlessly cruel, he seems to take a perverse pleasure in tormenting the men under his command, especially his talented subordinate Dick Winters. On screen, Sobel is the architect of their misery. He forces them on grueling runs up Currahee Mountain, revokes weekend passes for the smallest infraction, and seems to invent new ways to punish them. His incompetence in field exercises becomes a running joke, culminating in a moment where he fails to navigate a simple training map, solidifying the audience's perception of him as a leader unfit for combat. For millions of viewers, Herbert Sobel is the quintessential bad leader, a man whose arrogance and insecurity make him a greater threat to his own men than the enemy. The series masterfully positions him as the obstacle that Easy Company must overcome, the common enemy that forges them into a true brotherhood. His departure from the company is met with universal relief, both from the characters and the audience. To understand the real Herbert Sobel, we must look beyond the caricature and see the man who was handpicked to create an elite fighting force from scratch. Born in Chicago in 1912, Sobel was a man defined by ambition and a rigid sense of discipline. When he was given command of Easy Company at Camp Tocoa, he approached the task with a singular, ruthless focus: to forge the toughest, most resilient paratroopers in the U.S. Army. In this, he was undeniably successful. Sobel was a brilliant and meticulous trainer. He understood that the men jumping into Normandy would face unimaginable chaos and that only the most punishing preparation could give them a chance of survival. His methods were harsh, but they were effective. He drilled his men until their skills were second nature and pushed them physically until they believed they were invincible. The men of Easy Company hated him for the endless drills, the arbitrary inspections, and the grueling physical demands. But his training regimen built a foundation of unparalleled physical and mental toughness. He was not preparing them for a parade. He was preparing them for a war where the slightest weakness could mean death. He was not trying to be their friend. He was trying to make them survivors. The heart of Sobel's training philosophy was Currahee Mountain. The endless 3 miles up, 3 miles down runs were not just for physical conditioning. They were a psychological tool. He used the mountain to weed out the weak, to build endurance, and to create a shared sense of suffering that, ironically, bonded the men together. The mountain became a symbol of their hardship and, eventually, their strength. His leadership style was defined by what his men perceived as cruel and arbitrary discipline. He would search for minuscule infractions during inspections, a speck of dust on a rifle, or a poorly folded garment, and use them as an excuse to revoke weekend passes for the entire company. This tactic, while infuriating, was designed to foster a sense of collective responsibility, teaching the men that one soldier's mistake affected everyone. From the perspective of the enlisted men and non-commissioned officers, Sobel was a tyrant. His public admonishment of subordinates, his vindictive nature, and his clear favoritism created a climate of fear and resentment. While his methods were producing an elite unit, they were also systematically destroying the morale and trust between the commander and his men. The breaking point came in early 1944 as Easy Company prepared to ship out to England for the final phase of training before the invasion of Europe. Sobel's poor field navigation skills and his tendency to panic under pressure had become dangerously apparent. The company's NCOs, the battle-hardened sergeants who would lead the men in combat, came to a terrifying conclusion. Captain Sobel was going to get them all killed. In an extraordinary act of defiance, a group of the most respected NCOs, including men like Carwood Lipton and Wild Bill Garner, collectively submitted letters to the regimental commander, Colonel Robert Sink. They stated that they would rather turn in their stripes and be demoted to private than serve under Captain Sobel's command in combat. This was not insubordination. It was a desperate plea to save the lives of their men. This mutiny, as it came to be known, was a watershed moment. It forced Colonel Sink to confront the undeniable fact that the commander of his best rifle company had completely lost the confidence of his men. An officer without the trust of his NCOs is a liability, and Sink knew he could not send Easy Company into the biggest invasion in history with such a fractured chain of command. Faced with the NCO's ultimatum, Colonel Sink made a decisive move. He recognized Sobel as invaluable contribution as a trainer, but also understood his fatal flaws as a combat leader. Shortly before Easy Company deployed for Normandy, Sink removed Herbert Sobel from command. It was a decision that almost certainly saved lives and preserved the integrity of the unit. Sobel was not dishonorably discharged. Instead, he was transferred to a non-combat role, taking command of a parachute training school for non-infantry personnel like chaplains and medics. He would remain in England while Easy Company jumped into France on D-Day, effectively sidelining him for the remainder of the war in Europe. The man who had built the company would not be there to lead it in its finest hour. For Sobel, this must have been a devastating blow. His ambition and rigid pride had led to his own downfall. He had successfully forged one of the finest rifle companies in the Army, only to be deemed unfit to lead them into the very battle he had prepared them for. His direct connection to the men of Easy Company was severed forever. After the war ended, Herbert Sobel returned to the United States and, like many veterans, attempted to build a new life for himself. He settled back in his hometown of Chicago and became a successful executive, finding a place in the civilian world. He was a man who had always been driven by ambition, and he managed to channel that drive into a new career. However, he carried the weight of his wartime experience in silence. He rarely, if ever, spoke of his time as the commander of Easy Company. He did not attend the Unit S reunions and gradually drifted away from any contact with his former comrades. He had become a pariah within the brotherhood he had created, a controversial figure whose name was synonymous with their harshest days. This self-imposed isolation defined his post-war existence. While the men he trained went on to be celebrated as heroes, Sobel lived in relative obscurity, a ghost from their past. He had built a successful civilian life, but the shadows of Camp Tocoa and the mutiny that ended his combat career never truly left him. For decades, Herbert Sobel lived his quiet, isolated life. But as the years passed, the unresolved trauma and bitterness began to take their toll. By the 1960s, he was facing profound personal struggles. His life, which had appeared successful on the surface, began to unravel. He suffered from financial problems and, more significantly, a severe decline in his mental health. The man who had once been a figure of absolute authority and control was now losing control of his own life. The discipline that had defined him had given way to a deep and consuming despair. He was increasingly estranged from his family and the ghosts of his past, both from the war and his personal life, seemed to be closing in on him. This period of his life is shrouded in sadness and privacy. There are no public records detailing the full extent of his struggles, only the tragic outcome that they would eventually lead to. The iron-willed captain was, in private, a broken man heading toward a final, desperate act. In 1970, Herbert Sobel's private suffering culminated in an act of profound desperation. He attempted to take his own life. He placed a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. In a cruel twist of fate, the attempt failed to kill him, but the bullet inflicted a devastating and permanent injury. The gunshot passed through his temples, severing his optic nerves. Herbert Sobel, the man whose sharp eyes had once inspected every inch of his soldier's gear, was left completely and permanently blind. The act that was meant to end his suffering only condemned him to a new kind of prison, a world of total darkness. Following the incident, he was unable to care for himself. He would spend the remainder of his life as a resident of a Veterans Administration assisted living facility in Chicago. The once feared commander of Easy Company was now a ward of the state, dependent on others for his every need, living out his days in a world without sight. Herbert Sobel lived for 17 more years after his suicide attempt. His final years were spent in the quiet anonymity of the VA facility. He had little to no contact with his family, and none of the men from Easy Company ever visited him. He was a forgotten man, living out the consequences of a life marked by conflict, both internal and external. He died in 1987 from malnutrition and neglect. It was a lonely and tragic end for a man whose story was so deeply intertwined with one of America's most celebrated military units. He was buried in the Shalom Memorial Park in a suburb of Chicago, his grave nearly unmarked and unvisited for years. The man who had demanded perfection and had driven his soldiers to the brink was laid to rest in obscurity. His death went unnoticed by the men he had once commanded, a final, silent chapter in a life that had begun with so much ambition and ended in such profound sadness. For years after the war, most of the men of Easy Company spoke of Herbert Sobel with a mixture of anger and contempt. He was the tyrant who had made their lives a living hell. Yet, as time passed and the veterans reflected on their experiences, a new, more complex perspective began to emerge. Many, including Dick Winters, came to a startling conclusion. In later interviews, Winters and other members of the company gave Sobel a form of grudging credit. They acknowledged that his brutal, relentless training at Toccoa was the very thing that had prepared them for the horrors of combat. His obsessive focus on physical conditioning and tactical discipline had forged them into a unit that could not be broken. Dick Winters himself stated it best. One of the reasons that Easy Company was so successful was because of Sobel in the end. The great paradox of Herbert Sobel's legacy is that he was both the villain of their story and, in a strange way, their unlikely savior. The man they all hated may have been the very reason so many of them survived to tell the tale.